Hello friends, and I'm so excited for today because we are starting another monthly vlog for the Wild Book Box. I'm so excited. This is my second Wild Book Box, which is a secondhand book subscription service, which I have already done a video of. I will leave in the cards and in the description box below if you want to know more about the service and how I went with my very first month, which was fabulous, let's be honest. So we are going to start right now with an unboxing and taking a look at the 3 books that I received for this month. I will also leave all of the Wild Book Box details in the description box below too, in case you're in Australia and you want to have a good time with some secondhand books. I love how they're all individually wrapped and packaged. It's so cute. Let's open up the first one. So this is a book I have never heard of before. It is Jasper Jones, a novel by Craig Silvey. So in each book you get kind of like a little note explaining why they picked this for you. And so they chose this for me because I say I like Australian literature, award-winning and love and inspiring. Late on a hot summer night at the tail end of 1965, Charlie Bucktin, a precocious and bookish boy of 13, is startled by an urgent knock on the window of his sleep out. His visitor is Jasper Jones, an outcast in the mining town of Corrigan. Jasper takes him through town to his secret glade in the bush, and it's here that Charlie bears witness to Jasper's horrible discovery. Ooh, intrigue indeed. So that is book 1. Let's have a look at what else we've got. It's so fun having them all wrapped up like presents. Another book I've never heard of. Ooh, it looks a bit older. I think this is another Australian one, judging from the back. Let's have a look. My Place. We chose this for you because you like Australian lit, love, family, and political. Oh, we even get like a full picture of Sally. Love the hair, Sally. How thrilling. I've never heard of either of these two. I love it. And this is a non-fiction autobiography. It says, looking at the views and experiences of 3 generations of Indigenous Australians, this autobiography unearths political and societal issues contained within Australia's Indigenous culture. This moving account is a classic of Australian literature that finally frees the tongues of the author's mother and grandmother, allowing them to tell their own stories. Ooh, I'm excited about this one and how it will tackle that experience, which I know is not an uncommon one, especially given policies such as the stolen generation. Now let's have a look at number 3. Ooh, The Strays. I have heard of this one. I don't know much about it though. I just remember hearing that name, by Emily Bitto, and it won the Stella Prize. So all of these are Australian, are they? So this one was chosen for me because I like female leads, award-winning, and family. On her first day at a new school, Lily befriends one of the daughters of infamous avant-garde painter Ivan Trentham. He and his wife are trying to escape the stifling conservatism of 1930s Australia by inviting other like-minded artists to live and work at their family home. Lily becomes infatuated with this wild makeshift family and longs to be truly a part of it. Yet it's not Evan but his own daughters who pay the price for his radicalism. Ooh! So I'll take you on the journey of reading these books and kind of what I discover about them, whether I like them, and how well the Wild Book Box has done in choosing books that I will like. But that is enough gas bagging for a reading vlog. Let's get to reading. Good evening, friends. Apologies for whatever this is. I wasn't planning on filming today. I wasn't planning on starting, seeing as I have a little bit of time before bed, that I could get stuck into My Place by Sally Morgan. I've already just read just about 27 pages, I think, and that's taken me nearly an hour. So it's definitely going to be a slower book to get through. Basically, so far, we're just getting introduced to Sally and her family. She lives with her mum and her dad, and I think 3 younger siblings. She is the oldest. And this is in the 1950s, I think. And Sally's dad is a war veteran, and he's kind of in and out of hospital all the time. They also live with Sally's nana, who I think is Sally's mum's mum. Obviously, I'm not very far in, so I have a lot to go. So far, Sally, I don't like Sally yet. I mean, I know she's only young and obviously having a more difficult home life. But just the way she is presenting herself, I think she's doing a great job of doing it authentically. I don't feel connected to Sally, and in fact I kind of quite dislike her at the moment. But we will see how this progresses, and I'll update you probably tomorrow on how I'm going with this book. Time for an update on My Place. So I'm about halfway through the book, and honestly the first kind of third I found quite slow. Pretty much the whole first half has just basically been Sally telling us in chronological order about her life growing up. But we have learned a little bit more about Sally's dad. Basically, he was a prisoner of war. So he clearly has an awful lot of trauma, which is kind of a big part of the reason that he really struggles with his emotions and can be abusive. But a big thing that is standing out so far is the secrecy of Sally's grandmother, and how she just refuses to talk about her life, things that have happened to her in the past, where she's come from, anything about her identity. And basically when Sally's in primary school, I think it's when she's about 9 or 10, is the first time she's asked, where are you from? And obviously she's confused by this. She was born in Australia, she is Australian, but her classmates aren't satisfied with that answer because she isn't white. And so Sally goes home to ask her mother and her grandmother, where are we from? And this is where we start to see just how secretive Sally's mother and grandmother are about their family history. Because basically they tell the children to tell the school kids that they're Indian. Eventually though, when Sally ends up going to university, it does come out that they are Aboriginal. And she's now taking an interest in this heritage that she's just discovered she has. We've also just been introduced to her grandmother's brother, who seems a little bit more willing to talk about his history and his experience and his own life story than Sally's grandmother is. So far this story has been less about Sally's Aboriginality than it has been about the silence and shame that comes with trauma and the impacts of colonialism. But with Arthur, the grandmother's brother, now in the picture, who seems to be willing to talk a little bit more, it looks like we're about to get his story. And I will check in with you again this afternoon, hopefully, when I've read a bit more. Hello again, friends. It's a little bit later in the day and I have read quite a bit more of this book. I am up to page 306, so I have about 50 pages left to go and I'm really enjoying it. Basically, since I last left you, Sally has transcribed her like great uncle's story, and so we get from his first person perspective him telling us about his life from the time he was a small boy and taken away from his family, growing up on the mission or the station, and the friendships but also the abuse he experienced there. He ended up actually running away. Shortly after Sally has transcribed her uncle's story, he passes away. And so Sally is more determined than ever to find out more about her family history, but her nana, her grandmother, still refuses to talk. So Sally comes up with the great idea to go up north to the outback where her family is from originally. And her mother is really quite moved by her uncle's story and decides to come with her. So they head off up north on a 2,000-kilometer journey to go and find some of their relatives and see what else they can find out about their story. And through that process, they end up meeting relatives they never knew they had. And so many of the older Aboriginal people in this community are just so happy that their family has returned to them. So it's just full of all these beautiful, really emotional reunions of people who never thought that they would ever see, you know, their granddaughter. They didn't even know that they had this granddaughter, and they've come home. So this week that they've spent up north has been a really emotional and moving one. And when they come back home, Sally's mum decides that she will finally open up and tell Sally her story too. So even though in this book Sally is hoping to tell her family's story, it's also the story of Sally discovering it for herself. But I still have another 50 pages to go, and I think we are going to get Sally's nana, Daisy's story soon too. I finally finished my place and I loved it. So we did finally get Daisy's story, that is Sally's grandmother, although she still didn't tell us everything, or she didn't tell Sally everything. She kept a lot of secrets. A lot was implied. She still had a lot of shame and fear, but she knew she was dying, and so she wanted to tell her granddaughter some of her own story and her history. And I cried a bunch of times, partly because of what, you know, these people tell us about their story is emotional and upsetting, but more than that, there's such bravery and strength and determination in them reclaiming their story, where for most of these people they've felt ashamed and scared to do so for their entire lives. And I just think it's funny that like the first nearly half of this book I really wasn't enjoying it, and that had so much to do with Sally herself. That she, especially as a child, I didn't find her very likable at all. She was obstinate and stubborn and rude and often didn't have a lot of empathy for other people around her. But what I love about that is those characteristics, there's such strong character development here for Sally herself, in that those elements that I found kind of quite unlikable in her as a child mature and develop into her strengths. Part of that was like there was a few characters as she gets a bit older who kind of check her on the fact that she behaves in quite immature ways and quite selfish ways. But then I think a big part of it also is just as she starts to uncover her family's story, she has so much more empathy for especially the women in her family and what they've been through. And so by the end, Sally, this woman who at the beginning of the book I really kind of didn't like all that much, I just feel so much pride for. Like, I'm so proud of what she achieved, not only in presenting, like creating a published book of Aboriginal people and especially Aboriginal women telling their own stories in the 80s where this was just not a thing that happened, but also just so proud in how she managed to reconnect her family, and how passionate she was about finding out the truth. And when I love a book this much, regardless of the topic, I often find myself getting quite teary just thinking about it. Like I do that with a lot of books, and I'm finding that with this one. I have to keep like stopping so that I don't start crying just because I loved it so much. Now I have just started our second book, and that is The Strays by Emily Bitto. And so far the setup is basically we get the first chapter, which is kind of modern day, present time, I think, of these two older women, Lily and Eva. And basically they were childhood best friends, but there's sort of the implication that they had a falling out at some point and haven't seen each other in a really long time. But at this point in the book, they're kind of thinking about or possibly going to be meeting up. So that's just the first chapter. And then in the second chapter, we jump back into when they were young girls. And when they first met, when they became best friends. So I think basically we start with that snapshot of present day, and then we're going to now get like the whole story of their friendship and their falling out and their lives. But I am liking that it's set in Melbourne, in the 1930s or whatever is when Lily and Eva first meet and become friends. But it is early afternoon. Blair and I have just had lunch and I've done most of my jobs this morning. So I think this afternoon I'm going to be able to dedicate plenty of time to reading this. Hello and welcome back. I've just finished recording the Speaking of Which podcast. I was a guest on Sammy and Skylar's podcast this week. So I am happy and tired. But I thought before I kind of go and make myself a cup of tea and settle in to do some reading this afternoon, I would let you know how I've been going with The Strays. So I've read quite a bit of it. I'm up to the final part, I think part 4. And so far the book really has just been the whole of Lily and Eva's childhood and their friendship. And Lily's family is, I suppose, quite ordinary in most ways. Her family's very working class, whereas Lily's family is quite unusual. They've inherited quite a bit of wealth. They're all artists, and they basically have this big, beautiful house, and their 3 daughters, and they sort of end up developing a bit of like an artist commune and having these kind of like young up-and-coming artists just move in and live there and create art. And about halfway through the book, I think something happens to Lily's father, which makes him unable to work for a while. And so Lily's parents basically end up asking if Lily can go and stay with Eva over the summer holidays. And it's just a really unusual home environment for 3 young girls, and now Lily as well, to be growing up in, especially with a lot of the artists are young men in their 20s. Now this bit is going to be a little bit spoilery. I haven't finished the book yet, but there's kind of like a bit of a turning point that I've reached. I will put on the screen that this next part is spoilers, and when this spoiler thing goes away, then you know that you can turn the sound back on if you want to skip the spoilers. Basically at this point in the book, we're kind of getting to their mid-teens. I think they're about 15, Lily and Eva, and although they are still friends, they're growing apart a little bit. Like, they have their own secrets and they're just not as close as they have been. And then one night, the household awakes to Eva's youngest sister setting the library on fire. And in the chaos of all of that, and everybody wondering why she's done it, it kind of is revealed that Eva has been having some kind of relationship, we don't know what specifically, but some kind of relationship with one of the young men, Jerome. He's 24 or 25, I think. And so then Eva runs away with Jerome. But he doesn't just take Eva, he also takes the younger sister. And after a while it sort of comes out that Jerome was having a relationship with both Eva and her younger sister. These 2 girls are kids, and they grew up in a household where, these men had a lot of access to them and to essentially grooming them. Like, I mean, it's not called that, but when they've grown up with these people around them from the time they were 9 or 10, That's what I would call it, is grooming. But now that I'm into part 4, I think what's happening is we're going to jump back into the future where we kind of started off the book, when they're both older and Lily and Eva considering meeting up again. But that's all for now. I'm going to make myself a cup of tea and settle in for the afternoon, and I think I should finish this book today. I've just been sitting down and filming, and I figured while I'm here, I might as well let you know that I finished The Strays, and I'm really glad it's over. I don't know, I just feel frustrated by the story itself. I feel like it deals with unpleasant stuff, but it does it in a way that doesn't feel satisfying at all. And the characters. By the end of it, I don't like any of the characters. Any of them at all. I sound like I'm ranting. I guess I am. Basically, this is just a book about shitty parents, and how famous men, especially men in art, get away with doing shitty things, especially when it's eccentric and like just proves their genius, you know? Like that's basically what this story is about. But at the end of it, none of the characters realize that. What? The ending is basically Lily psychoanalyzing everybody, in particular Helena, who is Eva's mum. Also, I'm probably having a few feels because there was an on-page suicide attempt. As somebody who has attempted suicide, I do struggle sometimes with reading, like, explicitly what somebody does. I sort of feel like maybe the author thinks that the reader thinks that the Trentham lifestyle is appealing. Maybe that's what I'm struggling with. Like, the author thinks that I, as the reader, am in awe of this like eccentric artistic lifestyle. I'm not impressed by it at all. Maybe that's where the disconnect is happening, where Lily does kind of put all these people up on the pedestal and is kind of like excited by it all. I'm not. And I don't know, the Trenthams just like thinking they're way more impressive and radical than they are. Like, they're not revolutionaries. They're just shitty parents. I think the thing I like most about this book was I quite like some of the writing, and I do really like that it's set in Melbourne and like this time period. It was kind of fun reading about my city where I live. And I think what was successful about this was the way that it was told. It did sort of feel real. Like, I kept kind of forgetting that this was fiction rather than like an almost forgotten history of my city. Does that make sense? Like, I kind of enjoyed that aspect of it. I know a lot of people love this book. I was reading through the GoodReads reviews and a lot of people loved it. We are now on to our third book, which is Jasper Jones by Craig Silvey. And I didn't notice in our unboxing, but it has here on the front, the monthly said that it is an Australian To Kill a Mockingbird. So we already know that Jasper is an Aboriginal boy, and I think our main character is a white boy, and this is set in the 60s. I don't know, comparing it to Kill a Mockingbird makes me think that we're going to explore some racial injustice. I also think that this is maybe a bit more skewed towards YA, or at the very least it's a coming of age story. So I think this should be fairly easy for me to read, so I'm gonna get stuck in. Good morning, friends. I am still in bed, hence whatever this is. But I have been reading Jasper Jones this morning. I have read 2 chapters, I'm 100 pages in, but so far the story I'm already kind of really engaged in. Our main character, our kind of first person narrator is Charlie, and he kind of gets a knock at his window late at night from Jasper. Jasper convinces Charlie to come and help him with something that he's quite upset about, and basically Jasper has this sort of like place down by the river where he sleeps and lives, and one of their school friends, Laura, has been murdered, and she's hanging from a tree in Jasper's place. But Jasper tells Charlie that he didn't do this. In fact, there's sort of an implication that he actually was in a relationship with Laura of some kind, and that he really had strong feelings for her. But given he's Aboriginal and this small town and Australia is a racist place, he knows that if Laura is discovered in his place, he will be assumed guilty, like immediately. So he convinces Charlie to help him take Laura to the lake, put her body in there so that she won't be found, and so that they can investigate and hopefully find out what truly happened, so that they can prove that Jasper is innocent. I'm interested to see where this goes with the whole race discussion, especially given that our narrator, our main character, is a white boy. I will say that there's a couple of things I'm struggling with, that although I think it's trying to be quite progressive as far as race is concerned, there's a hell of a lot of ableism and sexism that is embedded in this in a way that is not being commentated upon in the same way that race is. So that's where I'm at so far. I'm going to have a shower, get dressed for the day, and I will talk to you later. I don't know what this angle is other than I couldn't be bothered to go get my big tripod because I just want to keep reading. But I thought I should update you first. So I stayed up way too late last night reading this because I couldn't put it down. I am up to page 340, so I still have about 150 pages to go, but we are definitely at the climax. I was starting to find some elements of this story a little bit frustrating, but I was still really curious about the characters and also just, you know, finding out what happened to Laura, the girl who was murdered. And I was just going to read, you know, like 10 or 20 pages before bed, but then I ended up reading like 150 because our mystery is starting to be answered and it is very unexpected. And more than that, we're also finding out a lot more about Jasper Jones and his history and the identity of different people is being revealed that, you know, I wasn't even expecting to find out more about. There is a lot of really sad, hard stuff to read in here. Obviously, it's a story about racial injustice, really, is the core of it. And a lot of that plays out with Jasper Jones being an Aboriginal boy who knows that he will be assumed guilty if anybody finds the body of Laura. But also Charlie's best friend, Jeffrey, is a Vietnamese boy. His parents are refugees from Vietnam. There is a lot of really shitty stuff that happens to them from people in the community. And in particular, there's a hate crime that happens in here. And so we're sort of seeing how racism plays out in so many different ways in Australia and in particular in this town. The experience of race and racism is still very different and presents in different ways for, you know, the Aboriginal experience and the Vietnamese immigrant experience. I'm still really not enjoying the R word being dropped like 3 times in every conversation that Jeffrey and Charlie have. For me, that really just takes me out of the story, if I'm completely honest. I just don't understand the choice to include it. Like, if the author went into this with like this progressive plan to really uncover the injustice of racism, but then it's just consistently dropping all these ableist slurs and is kind of like low-key misogynistic in some ways too. It just, I don't know, that disconnect doesn't make a lot of sense for me. Also, obviously, it is a story about race that centers the white experience. Like, this is very much a story of how Charlie is feeling with all of this stuff going on. And also, it's also a bit of a romance of Charlie and Eliza, who is Laura's sister, which is an interesting element of the story, I suppose. Definitely some tension and conflict and inner conflict there for Charlie. Having said all that, as far as like a book and a reading experience, now that I'm at the climax, this is really, really good. But I'm done updating you because I just want to get stuck in. So I'll probably see you in an hour and a half when I finish this book, and hopefully I'll give you a better angle because this is ridiculous. I finished Jasper Jones. Let's talk. So I have some conflicting views about this book, but overall I will say that I have really enjoyed reading it. And I'll just say it right up front, I've given it 4 stars on GoodReads. So it was a really good experience. There was a lot of strands that came together in some unexpected ways with the conclusion, but then we also sort of get one of those not open-ended endings, but like an opportunity to reflect, I guess. I think the thing that took me out of the book the most was like the R word being dropped like 2 or 3 times every time Charlie and Jeffrey were speaking to each other. Like it was totally unnecessary. The other thing I will say, and I'm not sure if this is a critique or a positive, I suppose it depends on what you want out of the book, but I did see, I think on GoodReads it's listed as YA, and if this is technically YA, I feel like it's not very successful as a YA, whereas if I just read it as a coming of age story meant for an adult audience, I like it more. I think a big part of that is just the way that the characters, in particular Charlie, is presented. Like, he's presented as pretty mature, and I would say maybe a bit more mature than his age would normally suggest. And just the way he like just drops all these literary references, like he's read all of Mark Twain and he's very witty and all of that sort of stuff. Also, there's a few times where like Harper Lee is mentioned, and so I feel like this comparison with To Kill a Mockingbird almost felt a little ham-fisted at times, like incorporating these big names and these, you know, monumental works of literature was almost like an attempt to force the comparison. That's sort of how it felt, which was a little on the nose. Having said all of that, these characters and this story I was sucked in. At one point in the novel, they find the word sorry kind of written somewhere. Won't spoil the specifics, but I did want to read this because Jasper's kind of just talking through in his own head what the word sorry means and why it feels so significant. You've got to get brave to say it and mean it. Sorry. Sorry. Sorry means you feel the pulse of other people's pain, as well as your own, and saying it means you take a share of it. And so it binds us together, makes us trodden and sodden as one another. Sorry is a lot of things. It's a hole refilled, a debt repaid. Sorry is the wake of a misdeed. It's the crippling ripple of consequences. Sorry is sadness, just as knowing is sadness. Sorry is sometimes self-pity, but sorry really is not about you. It's theirs to take or leave. Sorry means you leave yourself open to embrace or ridicule or revenge. Sorry is a question that begs forgiveness because the metronome of a good heart won't settle until things are right and true. Sorry doesn't take things back, but it pushes things forward. It bridges the gap. Sorry is sacrament. It's an offering, a gift. I have to say that I'm not exactly sure yet how I feel about how what happened to Laura was resolved in the book. But the very last page and the sort of kind of, it's not an open ending, but the sort of question, I guess, it leaves for us as the reader of wondering, like, will this town ever change? Will anything ever improve? Of what lessons have we, the reader, and the people in this town learned through this whole terrible experience? I really liked the way that was done. So any kind of questioning I had on what I was going to rate this, whether it was going to be a 3 or a 4, that very final page cemented the 4 for me. I really liked that. So this was a solid win, a solid 4 stars from me. I'm really, really glad I got the opportunity to read it. As for the other 2, I think it's pretty obvious where these 2 kind of fell on the scale of these 3 books. This one I adored, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. I think it is one of my new favorite books of all time, one of my new favorite autobiographies. And then The Strays. Now that I have had a little bit more time to think on this book, I do have 2 other things I want to say. I think the first is why I found it maybe frustrating was I said earlier how I think the author was sort of positioning us to be in awe of these artists and how eccentric and kind of over the top and interesting and genius they all were. And how I just didn't buy into that illusion. I didn't really see them as all that radical or revolutionary. Like, I understand that some of their art was very risque, but I guess, like, having just read My Place by Sally Morgan and some of it's set in the same era, I just can't help but, like, it's a bunch of white people who think they're, like, changing the world through naughty paintings, and then they do shitty things. Like, they're not the revolutionaries they think they are, and I guess I just saw through that to the point where I didn't enjoy the novel. I think the other thing that frustrated me, and this will be sort of spoilery for what isn't in the book, I guess, we don't really find out what happened to Eva after she ran off with Jerome. Like, we meet up with her again when they're like in their 50s or 70s or something, when they're much older, and we find out that, she had a rough time, but we don't, like, she doesn't tell us, like, what happened. So I guess I just was waiting for that to be this sort of, like, whirlwind, interesting, climactic part. And it's just not. It's just that she ran off with Jerome, and now, 50 years later, she was a bit traumatized, but she's okay. I understand why a character like Eva wouldn't want to be telling us, but as a reader, I'm like, so why are you telling us her story if you're not going to tell what is probably the most interesting part of that story? I don't know if I'm making sense, and there's not a lot of bad reviews on GoodReads. I saw one 1-star review that was pretty savage, but I think mine's one of the lowest ratings. So obviously I'm in the minority when it comes to this, and I don't want to harp on and, like, trash a book, but I really didn't like it. So those are our 3 books. Our second Wild Book Box are done. What a success overall. I mean, obviously I didn't like The Strays, but that's okay. I mean, I'm glad I read it. I've read another Australian novel now, which is always cool. These 2, though, were really good. Really, really good. A 4 and a 5-star. And neither of them I'd ever heard of before. I never would have picked up for myself. And this becoming a new favorite book. I don't know if I ever would have been exposed to this without the Wild Book Box. So thank you so much for hanging out with me this month and reading those books with me. I'd love to hear if you've read any of these, especially The Strays. I'm so curious to hear if anybody else really found it quite frustrating like I did, or if me and that 1-star review on GoodReads are alone apparently. But yeah, let me know if you've read any of these, or if you're planning to read any of them. I'd love to know. A big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon for all of your ongoing support. I really do appreciate it. And a big extra special thank you goes to Tracy Timmerman, Laurie, Lynette Brown, and the Hales K. If you have any comments or questions for me, please feel free to leave them down below. I'll do my best to get back to you. I do really love chatting in the comments, and I will see you in the next video. Until then, so much love. Bye.